I want to talk a little bit more about voter ID before we go. I think one of the big misapprehensions is that most Americans are covered by voter ID. And I've done an analysis of what voter ID laws are out there. So only 10 or 11 states have strict voter ID, which is what most people would assume to be voter ID when they think about it. Is that when you show up to vote, you have to have a valid, significant piece of identification, government issued, that shows you are the person you say you are before you're allowed to vote.
Yeah.
Now, other states have much weaker forms of voter ID, which really don't prevent anyone from voting if they don't have a voter ID. Am I right on that? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you are right. You know, in the event that you don't have your ID, you know, there are various fail-safes, including just an affidavit where you say that you are the person you say you are.
So you're signing a paper.
Right. You know, and if you're a person committed to committing fraud, you know, that's a problem. I don't think that the discussion, the public discussion of this issue is rational. Two things I would identify are, first, that the polls of those in favor of ID are always overwhelming, and they're always across races and across parties. You know, and you have variation from 50 to 90%, but you always have a majority of people who think that it's a good idea. Because as we all know, you need to, you know, produce an ID in so many situations. You know, to buy certain cold medicines, you need an ID, but not to vote. You know, that part's not rational. It's also not rational, you know, to make it about proof of fraud. In other words, the position that, to my mind, has been very well peddled to the newspapers, to the people who cover this, to the mainstream media.
The left media.
Yeah,
complex.
In a word, is that you don't need voter ID unless you show me that fraud is prevalent.
Now, that isn't what the courts have said, is it?
It isn't what the courts have said. The courts have said the opposite to the extent that they've ruled on the matter, you know, and more rulings are needed. But it doesn't make sense. A state is allowed to try to make their elections look valid, and part of making your election look valid is to make people think there are no holes in the system. A hole in the system is its own disadvantage. You don't need to show that the hole was used.
Suppressing the vote oftentimes occurs when there's this perception that the system's rigged.
Yeah.
And when you strengthen the system, people are more confident that their votes will count, and they increase the participation.
That's right.
And that's the thinking of the Supreme Court in upholding voter ID.
Yes, and it's, you know, why elections should be clean. But I mean, we don't have a federal law. We should on voter ID, but we don't have one. We have a federal law on removing people who've moved to other states. And I just would, you know, point out that under the NVRA, you can have fraud that even a voter ID wouldn't defeat. If you're in one state, you cross the border and vote where you used to live. Okay, you are who you say you are, and your ID is valid.
The ID is right.
Yeah, so, you know, NVRA can prevent fraud above and beyond what voter ID can prevent.
California, so there are 15 states, many of which are major population centers: California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. No voter ID in any of those states. So all of these big states don't have voter ID. So there's a major gap in terms of election security in our country right now.
Yes, and it ties back to something you said, which is, why do you oppose that? You know, what is wrong with demanding that people be who they say they are, that they produce ID to show it? Why would you fight, for example, as you know, has been successfully done, why would you fight collecting information on non-citizens who live in various states? There was supposed to be a question on the census, on the upcoming census. It was successfully defeated on Administrative Procedure Act grounds and on, you know, I think on invalid and poor grounds. And if you're litigating to prevent someone from asking that question, why are you doing that? I mean, I understand about the reasons why the lawsuit ultimately held it up enough that it was just abandoned. But what is your purpose? Why don't you want information? Why don't you want to know this?
Well, it suggests to me, again, the left wants to be able to steal elections when necessary. Certainly doesn't mean Republican politicians don't engage in election fraud. It doesn't mean that
they do.
The temptation for fraud doesn't affect both politicians.
It does.
But certainly lack of voter ID in areas controlled by politicians of the left tells you something, that the left benefits from it. Otherwise, they'd have stronger rules in place. And they wouldn't, I mean, the opposition to voter ID, those of you concerned about this, and I'm sure there are many people on the left and right both concerned about this, Democrat and Republican,
polls say so.
Horrified that there's no strong voter ID in the United States.
Yeah.
And so
I love talking, by the way, about this issue to people from Europe.
Oh, because they have much stronger rules.
They think I'm lying. They think I'm crazy, that it can't be like that.
Yeah, well,
you
talk to someone from Mexico.
Dip your thumb in ink if you're voting in Iraq, but in the United States, you just go in and say, "It's me. I'd like to vote."
Not to say there's not election fraud in these other countries, but these basics aren't being done here in the United States, and the left always points to other countries to point to progressive changes that ought to take place in the United States. But election integrity is not one of those issues they like to raise because we're really behind the 8 ball on that. And behind the 8 ball in terms of, as you point out, where the American people are on that. So you should know, though, those of you listening on both the left and the right, that there's a thin blue line here. They talk about the police. But on voter ID and election integrity, there's a massive amount of groups and interests that oppose us.
Extremely well funded. Major law firms devote a lot of free time to this issue, to these kinds of issues.
Nothing can compare on our side. So there's Judicial Watch, and
Public Interest Legal Foundation,
and there are some local state groups, one of whom we represented, 2 of whom we're representing.
Right.
And that's it. Am I right?
There are a few more local groups.
Yeah, but some other than
in terms of having the bandwidth to be able to do the kind of lawsuits that you have to do, where you can go after 1.6 million in active registrations, that's basically us.
Yeah,
it's basically us.
But in terms of promoting and preserving and protecting voter ID, there's virtually no one other than us.
Yeah.
Our friend Hans von Spakovsky over at the Heritage Foundation does great work, but he's one guy.
Yeah.
And they do good work of exposing some voter fraud issues. And as I say, on the other side, for years it was the entire Justice Department, and you've got every leftist group that has any significant activity participates in trying to stop any efforts to make our elections cleaner. And so Judicial Watch has got
the narrative in the public discourse is all one way. I mean, it's a fire hose. I will tell you that I know that I've given a good interview to the New York Times, to CBS. I'm thinking of particular reporters. When I talk to them for 40 minutes to an hour, and then they don't do an article. That's as good as I can expect. It's not like they would ever do an article that actually reported the things that I said in any sort of detail. If they can't get a hit quote from me after 40 minutes to an hour of work, you just never hear of it again.
You know, PBS used to have a catchphrase to raise support. If PBS didn't do it, who would?
If we didn't do it, yeah.
And it's really true in this circumstance. If Judicial Watch didn't do it in terms of these election integrity fights, no one would. That's practically speaking.
It costs money. I mean, it costs too much money to bring these suits. You need years worth of devotion to a lawsuit. And then when it's over, you need devotion to monitor what you did.
And that's why it traditionally has been left to the Justice Department, because it's a government, it's a law enforcement activity in many respects. And so Judicial Watch is doing the work of the Justice Department in ensuring that states follow federal law.
I would love their resources.
Yeah. Well, we've got great resources thanks to our supporters out there, and obviously we're able to leverage extra work out of you and your team because of your expertise. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all the latest news from Judicial Watch.